People keep claiming that Dragon Quest games are grindy by design.
I don't really like the grind in Dragon Quest. I don't like beating my head against a wall. I know it's very much what the series is about.
And that couldn't be farther from the truth. I've already proven that it's possible to beat Dragon Quest 8, Dragon Quest 11 and the new Dragon Quest 3 remake with levels way below what you'd get by just not grinding. And in 3 HD and 11, those playthroughs aren't hard to replicate, and even for Dragon Quest 8 you can find tons of similar playthroughs online. There has been a shift where newer games allow for more skill expression and they make retrying bosses easier, which in turn enables this playstyle of retrying a fight and beating it not by increasing your stats but by working on your strats. So why don't all people perceive it that way? I think the root of this is twofold: how the games present themselves and the player base's expectations. The first part might not immediately make sense to you, since the games don't tell you to grind, people just come to that conclusion by themselves. What I mean is that the games don't present themselves in the way that a game with room for skill expression would usually present itself like. Both in vibe, since Dragon Quest is very lighthearted, but also because Dragon Quest games don't give you a lot of specific numbers. They don't want to be overwhelming, so they don't tell you the formulas for damage calculations or critical weights. Like, did you know that your displayed critical weight in Dragon Quest 11 is not your chance of landing a critical hit? And grinding is a valid solution. It's not just an easy way out, but a playstyle. I usually describe grinding as a dynamic difficulty slider, and if Dragon Quest is your comfort game and you don't want to think about it, then that's amazing. But a lot of people bounce off of these games because they play one, run into an obstacle and assume they have to grind, then complain about the grinding. Intuitively, you'd expect a functioning person to try and play without grinding. But from my years of being in this community, I can tell you that people flock to online forums as soon as they die to a boss once. Because their assumption is that what they are doing is already optimal, so their level has to be the issue. And this gets me to the second piece of the puzzle as to why this stigma exists. People have certain expectations when playing traditional seeming JRPGs. They expect the game's design philosophies to not have evolved alongside everything else. The games are still turn-based like they were in 1990, so all the other aspects, including mandatory grinding, will probably be the same as well. And close-mindedness is something that specifically RPG fans are very guilty of. I think 90% of all players never even try to use a status effect on a boss in Dragon Quest. And the assumption that status effects don't work on bosses doesn't even come from Dragon Quest. You can seal Barrowmose's magic in all versions of Dragon Quest 3, and in the old ones that was basically an auto win. It stems from yet another false assumption that all JRPGs work exactly the same. You'll probably continue to see this for all eternity whenever a new game comes out. The guides will mostly be general RPG knowledge that the writers hope is still applicable. In that sense, RPG veterans often become so close-minded that they suck at the game. But since what they've been doing has worked for all other RPGs they played over the last 20 years, they don't change what they're doing, but instead change their characters' levels. And if they're not conscious about grinding being a choice, then they can't give out other advice either, except just grind, bro.
So how do you beat this boss? Very easy, you grind. It's Dragon Quest. You grind.
Another aspect to this is that people don't want to bother giving long explanations when helping someone else. But when a person is stuck on a boss and asks for help online, at least one person will always tell them to just grind to a higher level because they were at a higher level for that fight. And I'm not trying to come across as elitist here, but I think the people making guides and the ones voluntarily giving out advice on a game should know what they're talking about. And in a lot of cases they don't. It's a cycle that perpetuates itself that can be traced back all the way to the Dragon Quest games that still did require grinding. And the last mainline game that requires you to go out of your way to grind levels was Dragon Quest V back in 1992. But people keep nagging me. So anyways, synaptic plasticity decreases with age. The loss of neuronal excitability means that learning new skills after you are around 20 years old becomes increasingly harder with age. It never becomes impossible though, always keep that in mind. And continuously challenging yourself mentally is key to reducing age-related brain degeneration. I link an article with a really positive message down below. I am telling you this because in a sense, looking at a game in a different way from how you always looked at all the other games that came before also requires a tiny bit more effort as you get older. What I'm getting at is that looking back at all the encounters I've had over the years, the people that complain about grinding in Dragon Quest tend to be pretty old, which doesn't fit this accepted narrative that people who grew up playing NES games are hardened veterans. You know, that it's the young people that can't handle the grinding, talking about grinding as if it was an expensive cheese. I think if the average age of Dragon Quest fans was lower, then the community at large would be more open-minded, for example when it comes to different playstyles. And if the average Dragon Quest player was more open-minded towards retrying fights, seeing party vibes as part of your improvement process instead of wasted time, then I think the quality of advice they give would improve, which in turn would over time make the stigma go away. Not to get off track, but if my YouTube analytics are at all indicative of a larger trend, then the average Dragon Quest fan in the West is a 30-year-old man. And if you're a 30-year-old man, there's nothing wrong with you enjoying Dragon Quest. But I've been thinking about this a lot. In Japan, Dragon Quest is the definition of a casual game. The audience couldn't be less homogeneous. And that's how it should be. But it doesn't at all apply to the English-speaking community. Dragon Quest is as far from mainstream as it gets, and something that I've expressed before is I don't at all buy this narrative that the reason for its niche status is some difference in taste. I think Dragon Quest has the inherent qualities of a product that could be sold to a broad audience. The games are child-friendly but not childish in tone, and a big aspect is player choice and how exactly you want to engage with it. Again, grinding allows anyone to beat the games. But there's enough depth that long-term RPG veterans still believe that you have to grind in Dragon Quest XI. But somehow, playing Dragon Quest is not something for casual gamers outside of Japan. If someone plays a Dragon Quest game, it's much more likely that they're one of the aforementioned veterans. Which, if you think about it, is a pretty hardcore term to throw around. And this is the general vibe I get. Some people see old Dragon Quest games as this hardcore Vietnam-esque experience, and I don't want to call anyone out, but if you spend as long a time as I have in this community, you will have heard your fair share of yapping about how incredible those games were back in their day, and about how grinding is an acquired taste, about how people who complain about it are spoiled by modern design. I understand that people are proud of their achievements, even if it's something trivial like beating Dragon Quest 2. And it only makes sense that you'd sometimes let that pride show. But think about how bad a look that is from the outside. You're bragging about having spent a bunch of time walking up and down and mashing the A button. No wonder people think Dragon Quest is lame. And as I explained earlier, the people who complain about grinding in Dragon Quest aren't even some 16-year-old kids, because people under 18 don't even think about touching Dragon Quest nowadays. There's an article from 2014 that fascinates me. It's about how Square had plans to localize the Rocket Slime games because of a high demand. But even in that one, they mentioned that despite the game being targeted at children ages 8 through 10, the average Western Rocket Slime player was already 25 years old. But I can't avoid the elephant in the room anymore. These are all symptoms, but the cause, the reason why the Western Dragon Quest community is the way it is, it's Square Enix's mismanagement of their IP. The high average age in the community comes down to how neglected the series has especially been in recent years. Square can't attract new people to the series, but I believe the disproportionate amount of male players can't be broken down quite as simply. But I do think that it at least partially comes down to a gender gap from back in the 90s. Not many women played games, especially not RPGs, meaning not many women got into Dragon Quest. And while nowadays surveys show that 50% of all gamers are women, that doesn't affect the Dragon Quest fandom if there aren't any new Dragon Quest fans. Specifically, Square Enix doesn't localize enough games for people to have had a chance to see the evolution as the games release, which is why, as I mentioned earlier, people think Dragon Quest games stayed the same, and it's why few people who enjoyed their games stick around. There have historically been so many disappointing years for Dragon Quest fans. If you're European, you didn't get a Dragon Quest game until 8. 8 out of 11. As for the audience in the States, they didn't get all games either, and the early ones that they did get had these cringy, archaic English localizations that just scream nerdy and niche. I also want to point out that no mainline game so far had a global launch. Dragon Quest XI didn't have a global launch, and Dragon Quest X still doesn't have a global release. It's this self-fulfilling prophecy kinda thing. The games are niche, hence they don't get localized, which in turn makes the series become more and more obscure. Remember that article I mentioned earlier? They never did localize another Rocket Slime game. And those are pretty light on text, they acknowledge that in said interview. And anything that the community tries to do for itself pales in comparison to the big decisions by Square Enix. If a game wasn't localized, it doesn't matter how good the fan translations are. Even if it's better than anything Square Enix has ever done, it will never make waves like an official release. But I do want to be optimistic. The localizations have been okay recently. It's just a shame that the Western fanbase is now for the first time not being neglected, but doing the long wait leading up to Dragon Quest XII. Dragon Quest XI came out in 2017, and they didn't even release the Dragon Quest XII trailer in English. There's only unofficial uploads of the Japanese one, and I won't act like it's guaranteed that they'll advertise the game properly. The same even goes for a global release, but adhd got a global release, and the sales have been quite okay just from brand recognition alone. So I do think that they will take that as a sign to not neglect the upcoming Dragon Quest 1 and 2 remakes, and to especially not neglect Dragon Quest XII. They have an opportunity here to take the people that played one of the games because they always wondered what this Dragon Quest thing was about, and to turn them into Dragon Quest fans. And I really hope so, because if Dragon Quest XII does well, and if the Dragon Quest fanbase gets some new faces, then people will hopefully stop nagging me about how Dragon Quest games are so grindy. Or at least I hope they will do so less often. Maybe they will only be nagging me about Final Fantasy.